Today we are going to get started with our third section on Chapter 5, which is solving polynomial equations. So far this year we've learned how to factor a lot of different ways, and mostly when we've factored quadratic expressions, quadratic equations, and now we're going to use some of those same strategies and then also learn a few other strategies to help us solve our polynomial equations. So we'll get started. And before we really even get started with specific examples of solving our polynomial equations, I want to go over some of the strategies that we've learned already that we can use to factor. The first thing that we always want to look for when we're asked to either solve an equation or if we're asked to factor something is to look and see if there's a common term, if we can factor out the greatest common factor. Factoring the greatest common factor. So for example, if I had the expression 2x squared plus 6x, I can factor out a 2x from both of these terms and get 2x times the quantity x plus 3. Okay, another strategy that we learned was to look for perfect square trinomials. And that, remember, was something that looked like x squared plus 6x plus 9, where our first term and our last term are perfect squares, and twice the product of whatever squared gives us these guys equals our middle term. This factors to be x plus 3 squared. We also had a difference of squares. If we had something like x squared minus 16, where we don't have that middle term, we just have our squared and our constant. We don't have our middle term, we have a difference here. Both are perfect squares, x plus 4 times x minus 4. Now some of these same strategies that we have used are going to continue to be helpful while we're solving our polynomial equations. Okay, I'm going to leave a few lines of space here because we're going to keep adding to this list today as we learn a few other factoring strategies. Before we add on though, let's do our first example of solving a polynomial equation. And this first example, we'll use the strategies that we've grown accustomed to already. 3x to the fourth plus 12x squared equals 6x cubed. And just like when we solved quadratic equations, the first thing that we really like to do is to set our equation equal to 0. Subtract 6x cubed, and as I do that, I'm going to make sure my equation is written in standard form, going from highest to lowest power. After I do that, I notice all of these numbers are divisible by 3, and x squared goes into each term also. So let's factor out 3x squared times x squared minus 2x plus 4. Don't forget that after you factor something out, you can always distribute it back just to make sure that you factored correctly and you didn't miss a sign somewhere along the way. 3x squared times x squared is that 3x to the fourth. 3x squared times the negative 2x is our negative 6x cubed. And the 3x squared times the 4 gives us 12x squared. That equals our 0 here. And then just like when we solved our quadratic equations by factoring, once you have two things multiplied together equaling 0, use our zero product property. And think about, okay, what is 3x squared equals 0? Well, that happens when x is 0. Okay, that's one of our solutions. And then x squared minus 2x plus 4. This one's going to be a little more complicated to solve. Because this, it doesn't factor any further. So let's think back to some of our strategies we used to solve quadratic equations. With factoring, we could potentially square root both sides. And in this case, since I have that middle term, square root's not a good option here. But since a is 1 and b is an even number, completing the square would work really well here. Okay, some good extra review of some of those past concepts that we've learned. So to complete the square, we take b divided by 2 and square it. In this case, that would give us 1. I want this number to be a 1, but right now it's a 4. I need to subtract 3 from each side. And after I completed the square, this gives me a perfect square trinomial here, x minus 1 squared. We have something nicely squared here, square root both sides. And don't forget that leads to plus or minus over here. And since we have the square root of a negative number, it's I times the square root of 3. Add 1 to both sides after that. So x equals 1 plus or minus I radical 3. Okay, and that's our first example. If you would like to see another example like this, watch the second video. If you're okay with this, if you understand exactly what's going on and you're feeling pretty confident, go ahead and skip to the third video on here.